Today we're diving back through history and exploring some of the social, political, and economic conditions that shape and mould a human being. We thought one way to do this would be exploring it through movies, arguably the art form that was able to achieve the greatest mass popularity at its zenith in the 20th century. And to help us along our way, we have our first official guest to the pod. Long-time listeners will know how difficult it's been finding someone who would get all of our ChapoTrapHouse references. So we decided, screw it, let's just get one of them on ourselves. Welcome to the pod, Chapo's Matt Christman.
Thanks for having me.
So we thought a good springboard would be Barry Lyndon, the man born too late to pick potatoes for the British and too early to storm the Bastille. So he instead hits the road, hits the casino, and introduces a novel concept to the English aristocracy, rearing non-inbred children. This was initially meant to be a Napoleon picture, but the studios pulled the funding. So instead, Kubrick made a movie about the kind of world which could birth someone like Napoleon. The malaise, the decadence, and the cracks where a guy like Barry could wriggle into, but he was constrained by both his own personal shortcomings as well as the stasis of the feudal order. So by the time we get to Bonaparte, we've reached this juncture where the lid is about to blow off, and we have a figure much better able to navigate the rupture. So we're seeing this formation of a liberal political subject and the consciousness that comes with it. And we know what wins are going to look like for later subjects, for Napoleon, and for the 19th and 20th century industrialist, who we'll get to shortly. But in the meantime, what do wins look like for people in between? I mean, you're fresh off Hell on Earth. Do any names in particular come to mind? I mean, when did these guys start accumulating wins, and what do they look like? I mean, is there a through line through someone like Cromwell or Thomas Hobbes or Martin Luther?
Barry Lyndon, he's a social climber, like that's a sort of an eternal archetype, and that's Barry Lyndon, the context where he's doing his climbing is in that stagnant pre-revolutionary moment, but it seems like it's sort of an eternal archetype. And I don't know if I would compare him to guys who, like those early industrialists, who are literally trying to transform the world rather than, because I mean, I'm not an expert on the film or anything, but it doesn't really seem like Barry Lyndon has any interest in changing anything other than his own status. And it's because of the limitation of his imagination and his will that he stagnates and becomes just a besotted wastrel. And that was the lot of anyone who was trying to move up and down a social ladder without access to those more dynamic sectors of the economy.
What was upward mobility like in that late feudal period pre-Napoleon? I guess that's where we were coming from with that idea.
I mean, it was very much as that movie indicates. It was if you married well, basically. Mm-hmm. If you were able to go above your station and trick someone with wealth into supporting you, and a lot of the up-jumped people, not just vapid social climbers like Barry Lyndon, but guys like Albrecht Wallenstein during the early modern period in Germany, were able to make their mark first by securing access to some sort of family fortune through marriage.
So is that the stepping stone purely through matrimony? It's not really
military rank at all, or no? Like, I mean, jumping to Napoleon, that's how he ascends. What does your rise in the military? Does that have anything to do with that?
Well, rising through the military was, for most of those European powers, completely contingent upon your existing social status. Military ranks were largely purchased, and so it was more a reflection of an existing level of social status than a chance to climb up through a social status.
Mm-hmm. Because that's kind of a plot point in Barry Lyndon as well, kind of more of a minute plot point, but he leverages the Chevalier, who does have a standing in the Prussian army, to kind of work his way up the English aristocracy.
Sir, I have a confession to make to you. I'm an Irishman.
We wanted to compare a guy like Foster Kane to a guy like Plainview, in that we thought there was a nice juxtaposition of both the centuries that they're in, them representing sort of, as you said, the movers and shakers of their era in 20th and 19th, but then also geography, right? Like Kane in the cosmopolitan East Coast, Plainview out in the regional parts of America, and an extraction method of profit versus like the intellectual economy that Kane runs with his newspaper business.
The film is supposedly based on an Upton Sinclair novel called Oil with an exclamation point. Upton Sinclair loved exclamation points. And the character Plainview is based on a real oil tycoon from California who was born, as Plainview was in Wisconsin, named Edward Doheny. And he was one of a generation of oil men at the turn of the century who created that extraction economy in the West Coast.
And so, yeah, so I guess the real strength comes from the comparison with Kane. And we thought it was probably a point worth noting that Kane's empire largely came from his newspaper business, which already is a lever removed kind of from the Plainview stuff. Plainview's on the field of capitalist battle, and Kane's just covering it. And we thought an important tidbit really was he comes to fame with yellow journalism during the Spanish-American War, which, if we're to pinpoint any point in history that would mark the transition from the Daniel Plainviews to the Kanes, it would be the Spanish-American War, right? Because it's kind of the bringing of the Jacksonian consensus abroad. So is there a historical moment, maybe it is just the Spanish-American War, where we can say, okay, this is where we begin the transition from the Plainviews to the Kanes of history as different characters and the kinds of ethos they embody?
They're both building their empires around the same time, like around the turn of the 20th century. And the building of like specifically like the oil infrastructure is crucial to creating the mass media culture that allows the Kanes of the world to prosper.
I think you hinted yesterday, because he has somewhat of a film background, the character arc versus the static character, Kane versus Plainview. Moves the world versus
like we were kind of thinking, do their different I mean, obviously, like just like the environments they're raised in or mature in, contrast in sort of a character way that Kane is a man sort of wounded by humanity a lot. Like he's like motivated by this like deep-rooted abandonment issue he has, and he uses it to sort of unleash his name upon the world and try to make everyone love him. Whereas Plainview's almost the opposite. Like he uses these like human features and emotions, like the attachment to his son and the attachment to his brother, and he tries to reach out for them. By the end of the film, he's completely shed all of that stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, you could point to that just distance from the process of extraction, and if you kind of have to, if you see it holistically as one process, the building of this American Leviathan, and mass media and energy, a bunch of other things are part of it. Different types of people are going to gravitate towards different poles of that process, and Plainview, he does represent sort of the hollowing out of the self, and the hostility to all others that comes from that sort of primal accumulation, as opposed to Kane, who represents the public-facing side of that process that is about manufacturing a consent for this massive change in social situations and people's relation to one another.
Man, beautifully put. Manufacturing the consent for the evil that Plainview is committing out there.
And there's almost, tell me if you had a different read, but there's almost an impermanence to someone like Kane opposed to Plainview. I mean, Kane can sort of bounce around to different projects. He's closer to the actual levers of power. He's closer to the governor, say, and but it always ends up where the ventures that stick with him, the newspaper business, and even Alex made a good point yesterday when we were just kind of shooting the shit about this. He said, yeah, he even supports labor struggles at some point, but it just so happens to coincide with a time where there's a conscious concession to the workers, where we're going to give you whatever concessions we can to maintain this machine.
Well, and importantly, he uses it as a way for him to gain personal political power. It's not as part of a project that he believes in, but it's basically a way for him to break into an established domain.
Yeah, the stuff that allows him to do it is stuff that's going to maintain the empire. So stirring up war with the Spanish-American War, and even somebody like Howard Hughes, who would be, I guess, an analog of Kane and a contemporary, the stuff that he made his name for would eventually become the driving force of empire. So he was an aviation guy in the Southwest United States. So maybe he was a bit ahead of his time, but I mean, that would become the thrust of the empire in the post-war period. And then even towards the end of his life, he becomes like a Vegas mogul, which I'm not sure how this fits into the whole thesis, but there's something there where it's a maintenance and a driving forward of the empire.
Those media empires, of course, have proven much more ephemeral as technology has changed, because the difference between media technology and energy is that that energy becomes the basis for economic activity, and as such, it makes itself immune to technological transformation. So, the newspaper is going the way of the dodo. Meanwhile, oil companies are still the most profitable, largest corporations in the world.
Yeah, we had a similar point yesterday where maybe some of these points stick to the characters in particular, but not the archetypes. Because I know somebody like Murdoch would be much closer to Plainview than Kane, right, in terms of humanity and connection to it. And he would be the media guy. He would be the Kane, much closer in his economic outlook, but his personality traits would much closely mirror Plainview.
I mean, I haven't met him. I would like to know.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's why he's outlasted everyone else so well. Sort of saw behind the curtain and knew what he had to become. Yeah, I mean,
so why does personality come to the forefront with Kane, though? Right, because the whole crux of Kane, even Rosebud, is just asking who Kane was as a person, so what he cares about. So why does that come to the fore in the 20th century when it's kind of pushed to the periphery in the 19th? I mean, we know who the guy is, and it's just a matter of interpreting it. With Kane, there's an acknowledgement within the film that they care about who this guy was and want to get to the bottom of it.
I mean, I think a lot of that just comes down to Wells and Mankiewicz and the sort of theatrical tradition that they were coming out of.
Mm.
Like they were intentionally trying to take the tragic character arcs of great literature and specifically theatrical performance and applying it to 20th century America through its most emblematic art form.
Yeah.
So we've been trying to tie this back to actual historical analogs, and as we go on, we're kind of realizing that they're very thin, if existing at all.
Yeah, and dependent on, I guess, like the artist that envisions them. Have you read Oil by Upton Sinclair?
I've not. He's actually a pretty terrible writer. It's pretty funny.
Okay,
His heart was in the rightest possible place, but as a result, he got conflicted with any kind of artistic impulse he might have had.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the exclamation point at the end of Oil is the dead giveaway. It's like laughing.
He loved those. He loved exclamation points. Put them all over the place.
Not good, folks.
Yeah. Do you think it's a truism then that like the more polemic you try to be, the greater the art suffers, or no?
I mean, it's a question of like what form you want to put your polemic into. Like, it's in Sinclair's case, like the tradition of like social of realistic literary fiction was a very bad fit for his specific politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny, when we were coming up with ideas for this episode, we actually like went through and rewatched Children of Men, and yeah, we're big fans of your Letterboxd review of it, which I think maybe you're hinting at that. It's like you don't do it as a social realist piece, you do it as a slightly surreal dystopic, genre piece. Is maybe a better way to
yeah, I do think there's plenty of place for strident politics, but you have to lean into the alienation rather than to try to use traditional methods of evoking audience sympathy and empathy with characters and all that. It should be, Brechtian and alienating, I think, if you really want to go that way.
Sure. By leaning into the alienation, you mean in a Brechtian sense rather than a...
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, so we've tried to really no avail to tie these fictional characters to real life counterparts. I'll give it one last shot, and it's just a note that I wrote down about Eli Sunday, bringing it back to There'll Be Blood. She said, in personality, he's a lot closer to kind of a small town grifter, and he can never truly incorporate American Protestantism into his preachings the way Plainview can in a secular way. So is the historical analog there every Christian sect at the time except the Mormons?
I mean, he's at the end of the day, it's just him out for himself, and he doesn't have that social network that he can activate to resist the vagaries and the fluctuations of capitalism, and so he's sort of left to flail and on his own devices and become incredibly vulnerable and end up having to be ask help from someone who wants to destroy him. So yeah, I think that's accurate. The trajectory of Christian, quote unquote, American social life shows that as much as they were at every point trying to hold on to some religiously infused vision of life in America, at every step they were pulled farther and farther towards market relations and alienation, and now they're left to batter the storm. And now all of those church attendants and even amongst the formerly politically potent evangelical bloc is collapsing. And yeah, the Mormons are still standing.
Can I ask
now anyway?
Why does Christian, quote unquote, social life, why is it not strong enough to withstand capitalism coming in?
Nothing is. No. Nothing can, other than a social connection that is ritually reinscribed and that either resists or sublimates capitalist relationships within it. And the only place the only way you could ever even have that is where is the way that the Mormons got it, which was to take a chunk of America during the bonanza of the 19th century and create a alternative parallel social structure that then on its own terms can integrate into capital markets. If it's everybody for themselves, even if they all go to the same church, there's just nothing there to prevent everyone from being tossed around and tempest seas and thrown towards and away from each other over time and eventually pulled apart.
Mm-hmm. Because I mean, it's the encroaching market, and in the case of Plainview, it's the physical encroachment of this guy and his oil rigs, and you can only ever cope with it, right, if you're to butt heads with it head on. And it's, you have to form the parallel structure if you hope to survive in any meaningful sense.
Yeah, I mean, you can survive individually, but at the cost of those bonds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you get to go to church on Sunday and feel part of a community, but yeah, your life is being structured and ruled over by a different foundational base.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that ever touches Plainview in the film? I guess the obvious scene would be the baptism one. At any point, is there, I don't know, some sort of a human connection to a religion or a community, or is that always a facade because that's what it's expected in public life?
Yeah, I mean, he submits to those institutions and rituals to the degree that it's necessary to get access to the land. Like, he gets baptized because it's the only way that the bandies will sell him let him lay the pipe across the land. Like that, it's at every point it's only grudgingly given, and with the understanding that at some point there will be a reckoning and a punishment for those who would force him to be put into that position.
So never anything, even in that last scene where he kind of has to he sends HW off. There's never anything beyond just a purely practical and ruthless disposition about him.
I mean, I think he probably had feelings for his son, but
is that important for the character, or just kind of a note?
No, I think it is because it's what makes him turn on him is when he says he wants to go on his own and to have his own company, because as he said, that makes him a competitor.
This makes you my competitor.
That puts him in the same box as everyone else who's out to get him and who he has to view hostily.
So the perfect 19th century man, then.
You talked about Lyndon as an archetype of the social climber. Plainview as an archetype of a man who wants to hold dominion over everything.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. And it can just be far more successful in the 19th century under capitalism, or I mean, I don't, or is he just the equivalent of a king, or you know, I don't know what that archetype looks like in feudal society, for example.
I mean, it's hard. You can't really do one-to-one because it's the sublimation of the military impulse into, you know, competition in the market. So I guess like a conquistador.
Sure.
So by the time we get post-war, we start getting stuff like, you know, people living in the world created by these barons, both the Plainview type and the Wells type. So what would be some of the movies that get that better than others? Taxi Driver, something that fits into this somehow. And we're trying to draw maybe a through line between films and people that doesn't really exist. But if we're really trying to shove a square into a round peg here, what are some movies and some characters that maybe fit that?
I mean, even who are the plain views of the latter 20th century, or you know, 21st, early 21st? The tech guys.
I mean, well, Plainview is defined by the frontier and from the domination and conquest of new technologies and new geographies. So the closest thing we have now are people in the tech industry. But of course, it's this pathetic shadow of that, because so much of that is because when Plainview strikes oil, like that's actual oil coming out of the ground that fuels actual machines and builds a physical economy around those technologies. The tech explosion that has been the closest thing we have to a frontier in the last 40 years is a more than anything just a simulated stage to allow capital to circulate rather than the production of a new way of being.
Sure, it's got an illusory sort of nature.
Yeah, I apologize for keep trying to make this point, but is there a through line through Wells here? Because Plainview, you said, is doing the actual physical stuff on the ground, and then Wells is doing kind of the coverage of that, where it's abstracted in a way that it's not with Plainview. And then by the time we get to these tech guys, it's abstracted entirely away from any real economic engine.
Yeah, I mean, that's the modernity in action, that arc.
Then why are the tech guys so weird, right? I mean, Wells is a level removed, but he's also has a certain charisma and a personality to him that these other guys, the tech guys, even the ones in the, I guess the Social Network would be the one movie of any note about these guys. I mean, they're just weird, right? I mean, they don't have the joie de vivre of any of the earlier guys, even as their, I guess, position with relation to the actual engine of the economy changes. Feels like these guys are alien, right?
Well, yeah, because they are. I mean, they are forced to subsist in a fantasy realm completely. You know, like as I said, the late 19th century, early 20th century people were building a new world, and that was every day radical transformations were occurring, and in the way of life, the speed of life was rapidly changing, and the like the speed of human bodies moving through space was different. Now all of the change does feel faster, but it is all simply it's this illusory sense of speed. It's an illusion of access to this universal information this stream that we can contact, but we're moving no more. We're in fact we're stuck moving the same way over and over again. Well, these tech companies exist to create an illusion of movement. I mean, obviously, the metaverse is the crowning example of that. Like, you can stay in your house and put on these goggles, and you're going to be moving through space time at the speed of light. I mean, if that's your vision, if that's what you're selling, then you can't really spend any time dealing with reality. You're strictly and only dealing in a fantasy realm, so you're going to get weird with it pretty quickly.
So it just keeps getting weirder. Then that's the only logical next step, is if we've resigned ourselves to the fantasy realm, it just only gets stranger and stranger. Or is there, I don't know, some movie character that we could try to bring this back to, who could be the exemplar of something that brings it back to a more grounded politic?
I mean, it's difficult to imagine that emerging out of contemporary cinema, because it's captured by that same dynamic.
How do you mean that? Just what dynamic is?
The inability to see beyond. I mean, anything that's going to be grounded again is going to be not this. It's going to be a different social order that cannot be conceived of, and certainly not expressed through the machinery of popular culture that we rely on to provide our fantasies and our narratives of culture itself.
Yeah, I think that's like part of the reason I found Children of Men like particularly affecting is I was reading a lot of the contemporaneous reviews of it, and some people were slagging it for kind of being too open-ended or fairy tale at the end. But I thought that kind of made sense. It's like we probably couldn't make sense of what a positive project would look like using the technology of cinema or the art form of cinema. So you kind of have to leave it a bit abstracted or a bit open, and yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And we're just, all we can do now is, it seems, we'll see if that changes, is reflect what is currently occurring and maybe dial things up 5% for absurdity, but fundamentally not push beyond, because to do that is to deny a foundation, because we can no longer imagine that any transformation could be positive. And without that positive horizon, even suggesting radical change is unnerving, disturbing, nothing anybody with money is going to want to see dramatized.
So it's the natural conclusion from that, someone like Lebowski, who can acknowledge all of these archetype of guys and then just reject it entirely in favor of something else, anything else, even if not a positive project?
I mean, I think that was certainly a viable hope of the 90s. It was the hope of the 90s. Like, that was the hope of Generation X, is that they could live within capitalism while opting out of its most exploiting and self-destroying and alienating and immoral elements.
Yeah, it feels like
now we're 20 years later, it's no longer really something that can be realistically imagined.
Sure. I feel like, and I watched fucking Beau is Afraid earlier this year, and I feel like the first 20-30 minutes of that almost got a sense of the late millennial Zoomer kind of, if Lebowski's emblematic of a Gen X mindset, that like constant state of anxiety and noise maybe is captured in that movie, or something like Uncut Gems.
Yeah, I mean, like, actually, Uncut Gems is a good example of the alternative that now exists to being ground down and immiserated. it is that escape, but rather than the Lebowski escape into sort of a Zen, no ambition vibe life, it is to take one's destiny in one's hands and opt for annihilation on one's own terms.
Play the game for as long as you can until you're eviscerated.
I mean, that's the thing, is that Uncut Gems has a happy ending. Like that, getting killed is what Howard wanted, even though he didn't know it. He wouldn't have said that. He got to die at a moment of apotheosis, at a moment of sort of Kabbalistic unlocking. Like, he'd spent his life obsessed with the gambling and sports and playing them numbers and getting the odds and all with the idea that there would be some great payoff. And of course, if he doesn't get killed at the end of that movie, then eventually that victory is going to be robbed of him by time. He's going to spend the money, or he's going to lose the money. He's probably going to end up getting colon cancer. Instead, he's able to transcend spontaneously by unlocking the key to eternity. And that's like the only hope of escape.
Yeah, that's a good read. Is this, I don't know if this is kind of out there, but does kind of the Tom Cruise characters fit into this at all? Which is, I'm not sure how related, but it's do what we've been doing just at an accelerated pace until annihilation. Is there a connection there to Howie? Are they different? Are they?
Oh yeah, like Tom Cruise is like that guy. He's the real life version of that. He's going to keep jumping off of cliffs and shooting himself out of cannons until something happens.
Yeah, until he makes the greatest Mission Impossible entry, which ends with his evisceration,
his actual death.
Death on screen. That's the final culmination.
I would watch that on IMAX.
Yeah.
We've kind of in the last couple of minutes done the Gen X stuff, which is Lebowski and maybe the Ratner, the millennial, the Ratner and the Cruise. Is there anything for Gen Z? What a Gen Z movie would look like that would properly capture the generation? Like some of this other stuff captures Gen X, and maybe we're starting to see millennial stuff.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, this the format is dying. I mean, we're talking about movies, but like I think we need to understand film as such as a historically contingent phenomenon, the window of which is closing if it hasn't already. And so the younger generations, their stories of their own position and are going to make, I think, be generated in new and different formats. I honestly don't know if their psychological terrain is really legible by these increasingly obsolete formats.
I think you're onto something, mate. Just having sort of, like Ryan alluded to, I studied film for a bit, and it's crazy how much everyone worships the guys from the 70s and the 60s because of the things they were able to accomplish, while simultaneously vying very consciously, like trying to go for jobs as advertising directors, music video directors, anything but a film director. It's like this weird cognitive dissonance that they have. It's like, we know this was probably the best it ever got, and we pretend we can still do that, but the reality is we're going to direct Adidas commercials. That's what a film school now does.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to understand film as a contingent phenomenon, and I do really think that that the theatrical element of film is not just one way of watching a movie, but it is a fundamental element of the art form itself. The collective encounter is a feature of the artwork in general, and the loss of that means whatever we have now is not the same thing, and we should not think of it in the same way, and it's not going to serve the same purpose for people who have grown up now without having any real encounter with that form.
Because even the shows produced now, I mean, they're micro targeted demographically, right? I guess there are a few that we could point to as kind of cultural phenomenons where everybody watched them together, maybe Game of Thrones and Succession. as the last two.
Yeah.
But I mean, everything else is micro-targeted, done after 2 seasons, things like that. It's run by, I guess, the investors after every season, and then it's...
And even the Succession, like compared to Game of Thrones, like the audience is minuscule.
Even worse than that.
And Game of Thrones compared to the old network shows from the pre-cable days is a minuscule audience.
Succession compared to the final like season of The Walking Dead is actually like dead in the water. That show is still more popular and people made it, a laugh out of it. So yeah, it's like bite-sized chunks at this point you're inheriting.
Fuck it. Even the Game of Thrones stuff, it was people collectively getting mad at it. But I mean, it wasn't even a communal experience in like a wholesome sense. It was people varying degrees of anger, shouting about why the season sucked.
Bleak.
Not good.
But I think it's that energy or that desire for artistic encounter that has to go somewhere, right? Like Gen Z will create its own vocabulary and
oh yeah, no, like the energy has got to be expressed. And it seems as though like the successor to all this is just social media and a sort of media panopticon where we're all observing and performing simultaneously.
Periscope, yeah.
Far more entertaining just by like monkeys on the fucking typewriter's methodology than a film could ever be.
Wait, is it just Twitch streams like a Kush vlog is the medium of the century?
I mean, like stuff like that. It does seem like that's what people, as they become less and less, more and more isolated, and as even the social encounter of sitting in a room with strangers becomes, if not intimidating, something that people just aren't conditioned to seek, then yeah, like individual encounters with individual other people in it with a pseudo intimacy becomes the replacement for that public encounter that no longer exists.
Yeah, you're ahead of the curve on that.
I mean, that's the thing. It's all these things. They don't occur instantaneously. It's processes of change and yeah, the way it ends up looking, I really have no idea. It's going to be, I would say, probably unrecognizable to somebody of my generation, and that's always the way it is.
I guess that's kind of the flaw or the flawed premise we had going into this episode is we were trying to draw distinct differences between these guys and find rupture points. Like I'd even mentioned Spanish-American War as kind of like a point that would transition a Plainview to a Kane, but I guess it's more muddy than that. It's a lot more of gray areas in history. It's not these breaking points, which I think.
Yeah, like the points of change are really they can be identified in retrospect, but they should always be understood as inflection points in a process rather than ruptures or pivots.
Sure.
Well, I think thanks. I think we're sort of ready to wrap up, Matt. But thanks so much for coming on, man. And
yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, dude. Always illuminating listening to you. So cheers.
Thank you.
Just a sort of personal question. We can sort of cut it as well. But is there a point to the Kush vlogs or just your sort of work in general? Is there an impetus there?
I mean, I think like most of these things, it's therapeutic.
Sure.
Trying to make sense of my own position. But I'm not constituently designed for therapy, I guess. I can't get over the transactional nature of it. So the closest thing I could do is just like talk to myself, essentially. And then have feedback from hypothetically real people on the other side of the computer who can keep me on some sort of track.
Well, you do a decent job of it, I'll say.
Well, thank you very much.
Helped us out of a few jams, so thank you very much, man. Pleasure talking to you, and have a great day.
Absolutely, you too.
Thanks, man.
Bye.
No, I don't think so. No. Mr. Kane was a man who got everything he wanted and then lost it. Maybe Rosebud was something he couldn't get or something he lost. Anyway, it wouldn't have explained anything. I don't think any word can explain a man's life. No, I guess Rosebud is just a piece in a jigsaw puzzle. A missing piece. Well, come on, everybody. We'll miss the train.